I thought we were going to die. That thought didn't whisper, it screamed. The truck doors slammed behind us with a metal clang that echoed off my bones. My hands instinctively pressed against the side of the vehicle, feeling the heat of the sun-baked. Metal burned through my thin gloves. Around me, other women shifted, whispered, trembled. We were all silent prisoners of our own dread. It was July 1945. The war was over, Hitler was dead, and yet here we were, enemy combatants, though most of us had never held a gun. Women, Germans, prisoners, each of us carried fragments of fear and exhaustion that no one could measure. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the bench beneath me, the truck jolting over a pothole. Every jolt made my stomach lurch, reminding me that escape was impossible. Before the war ended, we had been told about the American stories. Warnings, whispers, they were merciless, cunning, and cruel. Lucky ones might be shot quickly. The unlucky, humiliated, starved, even tortured I had carried those stories with me like a talisman, a way to survive through obedience now, riding across the landscape in that rattling iron box. I wondered if any of it was true. Each mile brought a mixture of hope and dread. I stared at the horizon through the narrow slits of the truck, trying to see the end of the journey. But all I could see was dust, heat waves, and the blurred shapes of fields. Stretching endlessly, the metal beneath my fingers vibrated as the truck rumbled over gravel. The air inside was stifling, thick with dust, sweat, and the faint tang of gasoline. A woman beside me coughed quietly, pressing her shawl to her mouth. I swallowed hard, tasting the acrid metal on my tongue. Silence pressed against us like another prisoner, heavier than the walls of the truck itself. I remembered the British. We had hoped for them, dreamed of surrendering into hands that might show mercy. But fate had other plans. The Americans found us first, and now we were being transported somewhere deep into Texas. I didn't know where it was. I didn't even know what I expected to find. Perhaps a camp of steel and barbed wire, dogs, snarling rifles aimed at our heads. Yet when the truck slowed and the back doors creaked open, the world shifted. I squinted against the blinding sunlight, shielding my eyes with a shaking hand. Expecting rifles, expecting barking dogs, expecting screams. Instead, I heard something alien, laughter, clear, ringing, and alive. The sound of hooves striking the earth. A slow, calm voice carrying the weight of warmth instead of threat. You ever ride before? Fragolani blinked. A tall man stood there, hat tipped against the sun boots, dusty from riding. Not a soldier, not a guard, a cowboy. My mind scrambled to place him a soldier in disguise, a trick. The question echoed in my chest, louder than any gunshot ever could. I stammered, my throat dry. My pulse thundered in my ears. Don't worry, he said, his voice patient. She won't bite unless you do. He gestured toward a chestnut Mari standing patiently in the dust mane, tossing in the light wind. The air smelled of dry grass and horse sweat, of earth baked hot under the July sun. A faint scent of leather and hay mingled with the sharp tang of metal from the truck. Birds called. Somewhere in the distance, the wind carried nothing but warmth and movement. My heart slowed slightly, though suspicion lingered like a shadow. I couldn't shake. We were supposed to be terrified. That's what every story had promised, yet here in this unfamiliar light and heat, surrounded by fences instead of walls, by horses instead of dogs, the fear began to crack. I forced myself to breathe deeply, tasting the air, listening to the hooves, the laughter, the distant hum of life that seemed impossible after years of bombs and shouting. I had imagined cruelty, vengeance, horror, yet the world around me seemed too ordinary to contain any of it. And somehow, impossibly, the Americans were going to teach us how to ride horses. I laughed, though it sounded hollow at first. Then the laughter grew, mixing with the sound of hooves and wind. And in that moment, as I took my first hesitant steps out of the truck, I realized something profound. I had survived the war, but now survival was no longer enough here. In the heat of Texas, we might just learn what it meant to live. Even before we crossed the Atlantic, fear had been trained into us. Not just fear of a nation, but fear of an idea, an entire world. America was whispered as chaos made flesh, cruelty made law, greed made divine. Mothers and teachers told us stories Posters on the walls showed smiling soldiers aiming guns at unseen victims. Rumors traveled through whispered corridors, towns. Burned to ash women dragged from homes, children silenced by the cold efficiency of American might. Americans smile when they shoot, one instructor had said in 1943, leaning close so no one else could hear. Her eyes were wide, serious. I had repeated those words in my mind every night, a mantra to keep fear alive, to stay obedient, to survive. I wasn't a fighter, just a Luftwaffe auxiliary, a helferin trained to follow orders, to carry messages, to obey. Obedience had been survival. Survival had been everything. And now here we were, conquered, powerless, and waiting for the fulfillment of all the horrors we had been told awaited us. When Berlin fell, when Hitler died, we fled south, seeking the British hope burned faintly in our hearts, safety, mercy. But instead we were found by the Americans. They didn't shout, they didn't hit. They told us to get into trucks quietly, almost politely, as if we were guests arriving late to a party we didn't want to attend. Then the Atlantic crossed before us. Weeks of silent, trembling anticipation. The ship rocked beneath our feet, the smell of salt and oil mixing with the staleness of crowded cabins. We were packed tight, pressed shoulder to shoulder. The women around me silent and wary. Rumors drifted through the ship like ghosts. A prisoner somewhere had been stripped, branded, forced to crawl like a dog. Another had been shot for disobedience. Each whisper twisted my stomach into tighter knots. Each shadow made me flinch. By the time we arrived at New York, harbor fear had become a physical weight, pressing into our shoulders, a constant hum in our bones. And yet the first shock was not cruelty. It was calm. Trees lined the shore in lush green. Children ran along the docks calling to each other without fear. Sailors moved about with easy, practiced gestures. Not weapons, but ropes and cargo. The air smelled of salt coal smoke and something new. Safety. A few of us laughed nervously. Some cried quietly, unsure why tears came now, that the danger seemed almost absent. Then, absurd, almost surreal. A billboard gleaming in the sunlight. Drink Coca-Cola, it's the real thing. We stared. The world, still smoldering with wars, still weighed down by loss, seemed to mock us with normalcy. I had expected rage, death, cruelty. Instead, I saw advertising, laughter, a man tipping his hat to a child. Next stop, Texas. The word itself sounded like danger dust. Heat, guns, lawlessness. Each syllable carried the weight of stories, of films, of whispered fears. I gripped my small bundle of belongings, arms tight against my chest. Every instinct screamed for fear, every muscle tensed for survival. But the air that greeted us was different, warm, dry, alive. No screams, no barking dogs, no rifle muzzles. Just dust swirling in sunlight, a world open and strange. I whispered to the woman beside me, barely audible, "Do you think it's true, all of it?" She shook her head, eyes wide, scanning the horizon. "I don't know," she murmured. I don't know." For the first time since the fall of Berlin, I felt a crack in the armor of fear. And that crack frightened me almost more than the threat itself. Because if the fear we had carried for years wasn't real, then what would be? Texas, the name had always felt dangerous, even in whispers, just heat, guns, lawlessness. Yet when the truck doors creaked open, and I stepped onto the sun-baked earth, the world tilted beneath me. There were no cages, no barking officers, no barbed wire. Cages that promised humiliation or violence. Only fences stretching into the horizon, their shadows long in the late afternoon sun. The wind carried the scent of dry grass, of horses, of earth, baked by months of heat. Somewhere a bird called its song. Unfamiliar and startling in the stillness, we were given food. Real food, eggs, warm toast, thick coffee. Sustenance instead of suspicion. Showers with hot water, towels soft against skin that had not known comfort in years. Clean clothes folded neatly on beds with crisp sheets. Each small act of care felt like a betrayal to my expectations, as if kindness itself were a trap. We whispered to one another in the barracks, voices low. Maybe they were softening us before interrogation. Maybe cruelty waited behind the next door, but no interrogation came. Instead, one morning a guard's voice called across the compound, "You girls ever want to ride horses out in the field?" Men stood in dusty boots, sunburned faces shaded by wide-brimmed hats. They laughed. easily joked quietly among themselves and carried no weapons. Only a quiet assurance cowboys, they said, volunteers from nearby ranches. Not soldiers, not officers, just people. The first man to approach me was Frank. He tipped his hat with a small, practiced gesture, his eyes calm and steady, the corners of his mouth curved in a faint smile. In his hands were the reins of a chestnut mare standing patiently in the dust. "Go on," he said, voice soft. "She won't bite unless you doy." Hesitated. My hands shook as I reached for the reins. The horse's breath puffed in clouds against the warm air. Her muscles twitched beneath my fingers. I had imagined cruelty, imagined a bite or kick, imagined punishment for even touching her. But she stood still, calm. Patient. A laugh rose from my chest, sharp, hollow at first, then growing as disbelief loosened the grip of fear. I could not remember the last time I had laughed, truly laughed, not from relief or nervousness, but from something that felt like life itself. Frank adjusted the saddle quietly, his hands careful, precise. "Trust her," he said, simple. Not a command, not a warning, just truth. I took a deep breath. My legs shook as I swung over the saddle. Ruby, the horse, shifted beneath me, calm but aware. Every heartbeat thundered in my chest. Every breath was sharp and hot. And yet, with one tentative step forward, I moved. Slowly at first, then with more confidence as the horse responded to my hesitant guidance. The world outside the camp faded. Dust and wind and the sun's heat became a rhythm, a pulse I could match. For the first time in years, I did not feel like a prisoner. I did not feel like a German. I did not feel like a survivor. I felt something else entirely: hope, maybe, or perhaps simply the possibility of life without fear around. And the other women began to mount their own horses. Laughter rippled through the field. Some screamed at first, terrified, then laughed as their horses galloped forward. Others wept quietly, overwhelmed by the sheer ordinariness of kindness, the impossibility of it in a world that had promised only cruelty. I whispered to myself, this cannot be real. Yet every sight, every sound, every small gesture insisted that it was. We had come expecting fear. We had carried it across the Atlantic like a second skin, and here, in a place we had imagined only as a prison in the heart of Texas, it began to peel away. Slowly, gently, I looked at Frank, who stood watching from the edge of the field, tipping his hat at each hesitant rider, his quiet patience, unwavering. And in that gaze I saw something I had not known for years: trust. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps in this strange, impossible place, we could be human again. Day by day, the camp began to change. Or perhaps we did. The dust that had seemed oppressive at first became a golden blanket under the sun. The fences no longer felt like barriers, but boundaries that held us in a space of possibility. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigidity of fear that had defined every gesture, every thought began to loosen. Each morning we rose to the sound of hooves and the wind through the dry grass. We fed the horses, brushed them, cleaned the stables, learned to recognize their temperaments. Ruby, patient and steady, became my constant companion. Blackjack, a scarred gray stallion, belonged to Lena, who had not smiled since the loss of her brother at Stalingrad. The horses did not care about nationality, uniforms, or propaganda. They only responded to touch, rhythm, and patience. Frank moved among us, quietly offering guidance, but never pressure. "Feel her," he would say. "Not just the reins, feel the rhythm." And gradually we began to understand. There was a communication in motion, a language of trust that transcended words, fear, and history. In the afternoons, local ranchers joined us. Their hands were rough from work, their faces lined by sun and time, but their smiles were genuine. They taught us to rope, to saddle, to ride beyond walking, to feel the wind tear past as hooves pounded the earth beneath us. We sang songs we could barely pronounce. "Home on the Range," "Don't Fence Me In," "Deep in the Heart of Texas." Our accents fragmented the English into something new, strange, beautiful, and slowly the walls we carried inside ourselves began to crumble. Lena laughed quietly one evening as she brushed Blackjack's mane. Marta hummed while feeding a foal, the sound soft but steady, almost hypnotic. Even I felt the tension in my shoulders ease, the constant clenching of my hands release. One day, as I adjusted Ruby's saddle, Frank spoke quiet and matter-of-fact. "I lost 2 cousins in the war," he said. "I hated everything about it. But hating people like you won't bring them back." The words struck me harder than any threat or propaganda ever could. They were not meant to teach, not meant to lecture. They were simply true. And in their truth I felt something shift. A fragment of fear breaking, replaced by understanding, even small. Gestures held weight. A peach handed over during chores. A joke shared quietly in the stables. A book offered by a Red Cross nurse. Each act, each moment, chipped away at the narratives we had been raised to believe fear had been the only constant. For years now, kindness became the rhythm of our days at night. Lying on our cots, whispers floated through the barracks. Where is the cruelty? Where is the vengeance? The question haunted me more than the fear ever had, because the answer was, it was nowhere. Not here. Not in this place under these skies, with these people who gave without taking, who taught without judgment. And yet the absence of cruelty was more frightening than cruelty itself. It forced reflection. It demanded that we face something we had long buried: the possibility that people could be good, that life could exist beyond fear, that we could exist beyond survival. With each passing day, I realized that healing was not a sudden moment, but a collection of small, deliberate acts. Learning to ride was more than mastering a horse. It was learning to trust, to let go, to breathe again. The horses were our teachers, the cowboys our guides, and the Texas sky above us, a canvas on which we could imagine freedom. By the end of that first month, I laughed freely, without fear of reprisal. I sang in broken English without shame. I allowed myself to hope, cautiously, quietly, but unmistakably. The war had taken so much, but here it seemed it could not touch us. Not yet. And in that fragile space between fear and trust, I began to understand something profound. Humanity could be reclaimed one day, one song, one ride, one touch at a time. One morning, Frank approached me as I stood beside Ruby, brushing dust from her coat. His eyes held a quiet mischief, the kind that suggested he knew something I didn't. "Ever tried galloping?" he asked, tipping his hat. "Just trust her, don't think too much." I blinked. My stomach flipped. Galloping. My heart raced at the thought. All the lessons, all the practice had been at walking pace, steady and controlled. Galloping meant speed. It meant surrender. It meant letting go. Ruby shifted beneath me, nostrils flaring. I felt her energy thrumming through the reins, through the stirrups, through every fiber of my being. I swallowed, my hands trembling, and nodded. "All right." I whispered, mostly to myself. We started slowly. Ruby's hooves rhythmically drumming against the earth. Each step was familiar, grounding. My legs pressed lightly against her flanks. My hands guided the reins with careful patience. And then, with a gentle nudge from Frank, we surged forward. Hooves pounded like thunder against the dry ground. The wind ripped through my hair, stinging my eyes. Dust rose around us, a swirling curtain of freedom. My heart beat in time with Ruby's gallop, each pound erasing fear, each stride reclaiming something I hadn't felt in years. Exhilaration. I screamed, not in terror, but in release. The sound tore through me, ragged and raw. Laughter followed, loud and unrestrained, echoing across the fields. For the first time, I felt untethered, unburdened, alive in a way that survival had never allowed. When we slowed, Ruby's mane tossing, chest heaving, I was breathless, tears streaking my face. I could barely speak, the enormity of the moment stealing words. Frank rode up beside me, tipping his hat as he always did now. "That's freedom, Fräulein," he said. Freedom. The word felt strange, and yet perfectly fitting. It wasn't just riding a horse. It wasn't just the wind on my skin. It was everything we had been denied: choice, trust, joy, and the capacity to let go. The horses became our therapy. Each mare, each stallion, each foal had a lesson to teach. Ruby taught me courage. Blackjack taught Lena patience. The foals taught Marta gentleness. And through them, we learned to care for something other than ourselves. To nurture, to wait, to hope. Afternoon stretched long under the Texas sky. Sunlight poured over the fields, golden and unyielding, and we sang songs we barely knew, voices mingling with the rhythm of hooves and the soft calls of birds. Our accents fractured the English into something strange and beautiful, a testament to survival and transformation. Even the quietest among us changed. Lena, who had not smiled in months, her grief for her lost brother like a shadow. She could not shake, whispered to Blackjack, and laughed as he nudged her with his muzzle, Marta hummed. While brushing a foal, her voice steady soothing, and I who had carried fear like armor for years, laughed until my stomach ached, until tears blurred the sun and dust together into a haze of light. We began to understand something we hadn't thought. Possible joy could exist alongside memory. Freedom could live with fear. And healing could take place, slowly, deliberately, one heartbeat at a time, galloping across the open field that day. I realized something even deeper war had tried to define. Used to shape us into fear and obedience. Here with horses beneath us, wind in our faces, and open sky above, we were no longer defined by what we had endured. We were defined by what we could reclaim: trust, courage, laughter, life itself. And in that endless, expansive Texas fields beneath the vast sky, I finally understood that freedom was not just the absence of fear. It was the presence of everything we had forgotten to feel. The exhilaration of movement, the rhythm of connection, the quiet pulse of hope. The notice went up one morning on the mess hall wall: all prisoners scheduled for repatriation in October must report for processing. A hush fell over the camp. The words were simple, almost bureaucratic, but they carried a weight that made every heartbeat. Shivered dreams of going home, once distant and fragile, now pressed against us with sharp edges. Home. The word should have brought relief, joy, even celebration. Instead, it brought hesitation, uncertainty, and an almost unbearable sadness. We had dreamed of this moment for months, yet when it arrived, no one cheered. Texas had become something impossible, a place of peace. The vast fields, the sound of hooves, the laughter and kindness of strangers had seeped into our bones. To leave was to sever something vital. We whispered among ourselves, quiet and hesitant. Renate's voice trembled. "I don't know who will be when I leave," she said, staring at the dust swirling in the afternoon sun. Marta shook her head, eyes wide. "And I don't know what I'm going back to." I understood them perfectly. The war had left Germany hollow, broken, and burning in ways no one could repair quickly. And yet here, in this improbable sanctuary, we had learned something we had thought impossible: trust, joy, and the capacity to be human again. Frank approached me as I packed my few belongings. He handed me a small leather notebook, worn at the edges, inside a photograph of me writing. Ruby hair streaming in the wind, face flushed with exhilaration. Beneath it, in his careful handwriting, "You didn't just learn to ride. You learned to let go." I held it close, feeling the weight of it, not just in my hands but in my chest. The words encapsulated everything we had gained, everything we had learned. That last night we gathered around the fire one final time. The Cowboys were there, older, slower than the first days, but smiling as always. Someone passed a bottle of Coca-Cola. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of fire and violet. We hummed quietly, voices mingling. "Ill fly away," someone whispered almost reverently, "to peace." And we all nodded. I looked at Frank and said softly, "You changed the way I see the world." He tipped his hat, quiet and steady. "Good, now go change it." Next morning we climbed into the trucks. Ruby and Blackjack watched us go, their heads tilted, their eyes steady, and knowing my chest ached, I wanted to linger, to breathe the dust, to feel the wind on my face a little longer. But we had to leave, and yet even as the landscape slipped past the windows, even as the Texas sun shrank behind us, I carried something permanent, a memory, a lesson, a truth. War had taken so much, but it could not take this. The kindness, the freedom, the laughter, the horses, they were mine to keep. Repatriation was not a celebration. It was not triumph. It was a step into uncertainty, but for the first time in years I carried it with hope instead of fear. Texas had given us more than survival. It had given us humanity. Returning to Germany was like stepping into a country I had never truly known. The air smelled of ash and smoke, of hunger and ruin. Streets were lined with rubble, buildings shattered like broken teeth against the sky. The landscape bore the scars of destruction, yet people moved with quiet determination, rebuilding in their own slow, stubborn way. Home should have been familiar, comforting. Instead, it was hollow. My mother was alive, but her eyes were empty, her hands trembling as she passed me bread and soup. The words she whispered, barely audible over the din of Reconstruction, pierced me. Were they cruel to you? I shook my head, unable to frame the truth in language she could accept. No, I said, they were the opposite. She stared, unbelieving, her lips parting and closing without forming words. How could I explain that a country we had been trained to fear had offered warmth, laughter, and care? How could I tell her that kindness had saved us in a way cruelty never could? I stopped trying to convince anyone. Words failed where experience had succeeded. I understood now that true victory, in war and life, was not about conquest or revenge. It was about compassion. It was about the small, deliberate acts that reminded someone, even for a moment, that they were human. Years passed. I became a teacher, sharing knowledge, patience, and the lessons of empathy I had learned in Texas. I told my students about courage, about survival, about the quiet power of trust. But the story of kindness in a world of destruction I kept mostly to myself. Some things I learned could not be understood unless experienced. In 1972, I returned to Texas for a reunion of former prisoners and volunteers. Frank was there, older now, slower in movement, but with the same calm, sunburned face and steady eyes. He handed me a small box worn at the edges. Inside lay Ruby's horseshoe. I kept it, he said simply, in case you ever came back. I held it, tears sliding down my cheeks. I realized then, even in the depths of war, the seeds of peace could take root if someone was willing to plant them. Someone had chosen to act, to give, to teach us humanity when all we expected was cruelty. War had made us enemies. It had stripped our homes, our families, our sense of safety. But a horse, a cowboy, and a Texas sky had restored our humanity. And that, I understood, was a victory that no battle could erase. As I left Texas that day, carrying the horseshoe and the memory of open fields, laughter, and trust, I promised myself this: I would let the lesson endure. I would plant kindness wherever I could, nurture it quietly, and let it grow. Because the war had taken much from us, yes, but it could never take the capacity to give. And in that I had found everything. And so, the war ended, not just with surrender, but with the quiet, stubborn persistence of hope.